Hello lovely people, my name is Emma and today I'm bringing you my wrap up from non-fiction November with a couple of paranormal romancy things thrown in. So I had a really good non-fiction November. I managed to read I think 7 non-fiction books and I have 2 more on the go that I'm kind of carrying through into December, so we're going to talk about them now. The first book I finished was an absolute slam dunk, and that is Below the Edge of Darkness by Dr. Edith Widder. This was one that carried over from October and is basically a non-fiction account of a woman who is a deep sea marine biologist, and it's about her career and the various discoveries that she's made, and her focus is very much on bioluminescence because a startling amount of life on this planet can create light in their own way, which is what bioluminescence is. It's different from phosphorescence, which is more like absorbing light rays and then being able to reflect them back. This is actually like generating light in your own way, and this is a very energy intensive process, so it's looking at why on earth would this evolve in the various different ways that it is used down in the deep sea. I really enjoyed this book. There is a little bit of a segue into Dr. Edith Widder's personal life. She had a fairly major operation that went quite badly wrong at the beginning of her life, and it sort of gets mentioned, which I felt was a little bit unnecessary. It sort of then didn't feature in the rest of the book, but the actual science itself was incredibly cool, and her experiences in deep sea submersibles and the way that that technology advancing changed and impacted how she could explore things and the kind of styles of experiments that she could do. So really cool. She's credited as one of the sort of in the team of one of the people who had the first sighting of a giant squid, which is very awesome. And there's also a random cameo from Fidel Castro in this, because it turns out he's super into diving, and they do a documentary off the coast of Cuba, and it's very cool. So that was unexpected weird political cameo in it. I think this book is fantastic if you've got an interest in science, an interest in submersibles, an interest in marine life in general, and also an interest in what is it like to actually be a scientist and kind of the funding process and things. I would lump this in with books like Lab Girl, sort of the underwater version. Really great read. Then I finished The Queens of Animation by Nathalia Holt. This is a look at the women who were involved in early Disney and sort of the animators and storytellers who have been lost to history, as the women were often not given credit. It also doubles as a really lovely look at the history of Disney and how it has sort of developed over the years, what its big movies were and how it tried to keep itself going. A look at Walt Disney as a character in himself, and also a look at the technology behind animation and how various advances in things like computer animation, but also film techniques and stuff, has dramatically changed the animation game over the years. Disney, the first movies were put out in the 20s, so it really is a long expansive history. It's also its look at interactions with major world events like World War II. I loved this book. This was another slam dunk. I started the month off really strong. I thought it was wonderful how Nathalia managed to cherry pick certain women who were really good at showcasing things that were happening in Disney, sort of spotlighting them on their life, but then also the macro look of the world of Disney. And it's sort of fascinating how in so many different industries, whether it be in animation or in science or in various different areas, the jobs that still require an incredible amount of skill that immediately get relegated to considered to be unskilled and not as important just because a woman does them. So and this one, the colorists who were in charge of colouring in the storyteller and the animators actual sketches were often considered to be sort of less importance, when I would argue colour composition is one of the major components to art. And it really struck me as being very similar to in Hidden Figures, which is a look at women's role within NASA, how the term computer actually referred to, before we had the technology, a woman who would sit and run the calculations and do the manual by hand maths required for the bigger stuff. So the men would sort of assign the maths problem, and then the woman would run the numbers and actually make sure it was okay, which still requires an incredible amount of skill and an incredible amount of mathematical knowledge, but is automatically relegated to grunt work as soon as a woman does it. And the similarities between Hidden Figures and the Queens of Animation was so striking. It doesn't matter if you're in the humanities or the sciences, women's work is always considered drudgery. But yeah, wonderful book. I listened to an audiobook. Stunning all around. Then I read The Girl with 7 Names, which is by Hyeonseo Lee. This is about a woman who escapes North Korea, and it's about her life. Now, it was very interesting from a memoir. I know very little about North Korea. Obviously, finding out a story about somebody who lived over the border and was actually in the North Korean kind of dictatorship and everything, very interesting, and sort of history in general through it. But I really struggled with this book because it just felt like the author never really acknowledged her own role and her own agency within like her situations. The way that she basically ends up escaping is her family live right on the border between North Korea and China, and her mother is like involved heavily in smuggling rings, which is a very common practice in North Korea, especially along the borders. And she decides a couple of months before her 18th birthday, when at that point when she turns 18 she'll be tried as an adult if she gets in trouble with anything. Before then they're a little bit more lenient. She decides she's gonna actually like hop over the border to see some relatives who live in China and like do a rebellious thing. And she's only supposed to be gone a night. She like goes missing for a month basically, and then she can't come back because to do so everyone's like, well, where the hell have you been? And she'll be put in like a camp and it'll all be very, very bad. And so in doing so, she's put her brother and her mother at quite a high level of risk. They've had to relocate and change their names and all sorts of stuff like that. And it just never really feels like she acknowledges that what she did was fundamentally incredibly stupid and really, really risky. And as you know, we've all been teenagers and we've all done stupid things, but there was a real lack of like acknowledgement that, hey, I did something that completely changed the course of my life and I did it on a whim, and in doing so it put everybody I love in jeopardy. So I found her quite frustrating. Even though her story and her situation was fascinating, it felt like there wasn't really any like perspective ability to look back and sort of critically analyze some of her decision-making process. So yeah, it's a good book that I would still recommend, but I found her frustrating. The next book that I read was The Windrush Betrayal by Amelia, and this I listened to an audiobook, and this is a look at the basically Windrush scandal in the UK, which happened where the government was trying to force people who had come over in the Windrush generation, or indeed actually quite often the generation after that, when come over from sort of places that were still considered like British settlements like the Caribbean and places like that, to come over to the UK to like immigrate into work, and then in doing so 50 years later they were trying to be shipped back to where they belonged because they didn't have appropriate documentation, because said documentation wasn't necessary at the time, or didn't exist, or has been lost over the years. And sort of the scandal of forcing these people who are often in their 60s and 70s, who had spent their whole life in Britain working, paying taxes, being like upstanding members of society, and actually regardless whether upstanding members of society were invited over, so it doesn't matter if you fall on hard times or not, and were just trying to be shipped off to countries that they had no real connections to anymore, no family, no home, and no ability to like do anything, sort of the scandal around it. It was a really, really interesting book to look at like how the sort of story unfolded. Amelia was involved with breaking the story. I can't remember what newspaper she worked for, but she was involved, possibly The Guardian, but I might be wrong there. She was involved in a lot of the groundwork for meeting these people, writing these stories, and then really pushing local MPs and politicians to actually answer this. And then the scandal did break in sort of much more of like a bigger news, everybody involved way, and she was again involved in kind of the grilling of that process. So there was a little bit in the middle where it got a little bit samey, because we did meet multiple people who'd basically had the same situation happen to them, but I also do understand and respect that the point to that was to kind of show the number of victims involved in this. And so yeah, really, really fascinating and interesting, and a great read if you quite often books about race focus a lot on America or from American authors, and it can be very easy in Britain to be like, we don't have a race issue, we have a class issue. This is something that frequently gets totted out when conversations about Britain and race and racism get bandied around, and actually books like The Windrush Betrayal really do highlight that no, like we weren't doing this kind of thing to people who were immigrating in from Eastern Europe who happen to have the same skin colour. No, this was very much a targeted attack at people who didn't look like what we considered quintessential Britishness to be. So there is very much a underlying racism and race issue within the UK, and it very much stems back to a long and very ugly history with colonialism, and the book did a really good job of discussing that as well. So incredible read, totally worth reading. Then I was getting a little bit bogged down in non-fiction November and wanted a change of pace. So I did totally get brought up with the hype. I listened to many of the girls at work who were raving about this book, and I read Fourth Wing by Rebecca Yarros. Now, if you're over on the non-fiction side of BookTube, you might not be aware of this book. However, I think you probably have had it stumble across your path, because I think you'd have to be under a rock to not have heard about this book at the moment. Fourth Wing is the first book from Rebecca Yarros' series. I think it's her debut novel, and it is basically the hot new paranormal romance fantasy book that is out at the moment. The sequel has just come out. I will not be reading it anytime soon, and I wanted to check it out. I I didn't want to believe the hype for this book. I get so annoyed when books get overhyped like this, and I really try to avoid them. But I started the book at 10:30 at night and like finished it at 4 AM because I was just so sucked into these characters in this world. And believe me, I'm really annoyed about that fact because I wanted to not like this book. I wanted it to not deserve the hype. I was so annoyed about how much it had been all over my Instagram reels and all over BookTube. And I didn't want it to work, but it did. And I had a really good time. It's very cool world building. It is a world where there are dragon riders who basically have to train in this really elite college, which has an insane death rate. You don't drop out, you die. Like half the class dies or something ridiculous. And then the idea is that they become dragon riders. They get picked by dragons, which forms like a sort of eternal bond, where if the dragon dies, the rider dies. And then they are supposed to be fighting it against their borders. And then obviously plot twists ensued. There was a massive enemies to lovers romance in this that was freaking hot. Like, I was here for that. And yeah, it was really, really good fun. So yeah, basically I read it, it was great. I would say if you are into sort of romance fantasy books, this is worth a read. I think it's entertaining. I know book 2 has got a lot of negative reviews recently, so I'm going to be avoiding it for a little bit longer, give a bit of time for the hype to die down and then check it out. But I was pleased I picked this one up, and it was a perfect little palette cleanser in amongst some of the much heavier, denser books that I've been reading in November for non-fiction November. So good fun all around. Then we got straight back on our much denser non-fiction reading, and I finished The Medici by Paul Strathern. This is a look at the Medici, who are a big Italian family, sort of members of nobility, and it is about their rise to power and them keeping power over various generations. The Medici were one of the earlier banks that were formed and were very heavily involved in like the church and sort of the Vatican and sort of decisions on who should be Pope. They were also very heavily involved in the art world, and they very much patronized like people like Leonardo da Vinci and Botticelli and Michelangelo, and they had their fingers in many pies. This was a really, really good book, and I would definitely recommend Paul Strathern's writing. It was slow going in many places because there are many names that are the same. There are many situations that are the same because actually if you've got 2 or 3 warring factions, whether it be, you know, these guys are based in Florence, but you know, Florence is fighting Naples, who's fighting Milan, kind of level stuff, and that definitely like reiterates every couple of decades, in the same way that, you know, the various big name families are also going to be fighting each other quite a lot, and many of them like to name their sons after their grandfathers, so you kind of get this alternating like Lorenzo Cosimo situation happening with the names. It's like how everybody in British history is called Henry, so that kind of made it a little bit heavy going in a few places, but really definitely worth a read. Very interesting, and I feel like my sort of general knowledge about Italian history and how Italy as like a concept has formed is definitely much stronger. The stuff about the banking was really, really interesting as well, and also the involvement of Catholicism within it and kind of the way that the church functioned. It's sort of very fascinating from that side of things as well, so would definitely recommend. This is the bit where the month started to take a bit of a downward turn, and I kind of have 3 non-fictions in a row that were not great. The first one of those is Threads of Life by Clare Hunter, and I wanted to like this book so much. This claims to be a history of the world through the eye of a needle, and is looking at fabric and fabric craft and embroidery more specifically, and kind of stitching, and the way that it has sort of played an important role within history and sort of been often undervalued because it is considered women's work. Or at least that's what it said it was on the blurb. In reality, it's actually sort of a weird mishmash of the various projects that Clare has done in her life, and sort of felt like it read like a collection of Wikipedia articles about different aspects of sewing, because she doesn't go into much detail about a lot of the history and a lot of the different like cultural differences that are out there about sewing. So there are a few chapters that were very strong that looked in a lot of detail, like there's a great one about Mary Queen of Scots, who used a lot of her sewing as sort of a way of communicating with people when she was imprisoned, and there's some sort of interesting chapters focused on very specific areas, but for the bulk of it, it's kind of a whistle-stop tour that doesn't really go into enough detail about anything, which is why I say it reads like a Wikipedia article. It'd be like, you know, the Japanese believe this about fabric, and then the Somali believe this, and then there's the Vikings did this, and each one is only like a sentence or a sentence and a half, and you're just kind of getting a litany of like different belief structures and different ways of interacting with fabric that then don't actually like connect to anything or deepen my understanding in any meaningful way. Like there's not been enough of a deep dive into any of these areas to feel like I've actually like expanded my knowledge. And when I think about books like The Golden Thread by Cassius St. Clair, which takes each chapter is focused on a different type of fabric, and in that one it goes into a lot of detail about one specific area of the world and of history connected to that fabric and why it's been important in like the history of humanity. This book, I was kind of expecting a similar thing, and instead we jump all over the place in terms of time periods and areas, and each individual chapter we can be talking about Scottish kilts to then Palestinian sort of rioters and sort of freedom fight, and it's all over the place. And then you throw in Claire's project that she did in Scotland with a bunch of veterans sewing, and it just lacked the structure that I was really looking for from this book. Also, it gets really samey. So like, this is coming from somebody who really likes fabric craft and, you know, I've sewed on and off for most of my life in many ways, and I really love embroidery, and even I was getting a bit bored of the descriptions of embroidery and how she waxes lyrically about how pretty it is. So yeah, not a strong book as far as I'm concerned. Then I finished Bad Pharma by Ben Goldacre, and this is another book that was a bit of a bummer. This is a look at the pharmaceutical companies / how studies are done to prove how well drugs work, and then how that information gets passed down to the medical community for decisions to be made. Now, do you ever have it where you read a book and you like desperately wish literally anybody else had written this book because the author is annoying you that much? This was really the vibe I had with Bad Pharma. I didn't particularly disagree with a lot of the central premises that Ben Goldacre was working from. I do think that we need to be very careful with how we consider data that is given to us by pharmaceutical companies who have a vested interest in showing their new drugs in a positive light because they have sales to make. I do think that we should be very considerate like of sales reps and pharmaceutical reps and the way that they will push certain drugs. I do think it is important that we have transparency within pharmaceutical studies and like medical studies in general, and it was very alarming to find out that there is not as much transparency as you would expect there to be, and indeed the ability to pass through that information and kind of the regulations and checks that are made for that information are very lacking, and doctors don't even really have time to sit down and like look at that information anyway. So an alarming amount of medical decisions are made based on anecdotal evidence, or because my professor 20 years ago told me to do it like this way, or because the pharmaceutical rep bought me dinner last week and I feel like socially obliged to push their drug now. I agree with all of these kind of premises, but Ben Goldacre is really annoying. Like, every single page was sort of this fourth wall breaking, you'll never guess what happened next, reader, and dear reader, if you're as outraged as me, then if you're not as outraged, then you're missing the point kind of energy. And it read like a BuzzFeed article before BuzzFeed I think was even really a big thing. So yeah, it was a real struggle, and there were also certain areas where I feel like he conflated what is sort of a bit of a well duh moment about sort of how the pharmaceutical companies work, and conflated that with like actual genuine sort of malicious intent from pharmaceutical companies. And there was a lot of like, you wouldn't believe how many people have been harmed by this, but then there was no real actual like demonstration of the evidence of where that harm was. It was very sort of counterfactual and circumspect, and his sort of conclusions about how we would change the system just read as wildly naive. This idea of like drug companies releasing all of their data for doctors to sit and pass through these records, like as if they have time for that. So the idea would be to have a complete overhaul of how the system works, how we finance medicine, and also how we finance drug companies. It felt very simultaneously naive but also jaded, which was very frustrating. He also at the very beginning is like, I'm not going to take the time to explain what these drugs mean sometimes, or these conditions mean sometimes. You're just going to have to take my word for it that these things are fairly standard medicine, moving on. And that really pissed me off, because I feel like if he'd cut a lot of the bits where he was like, dear reader, we should all be outraged about this, it takes 30 seconds to write down what a drug does, like, or it takes 30 seconds to write down what a disease is. Like, you don't have to go into like all the different pharmacokinetics shit about it. You could just be like, a drug to lower blood pressure, an antidepressant, a bronchodilator. Like, you don't have to go crazy detailed. And I spent more time googling what the stuff was, because I feel like, again, that really impacts like how outraged should I be. Is it that this was a completely elective procedure, a condition that even if you have it, the sort of impact to your life is not that big a deal, and so therefore if you are taking something that's going to cause horrendous side effects that are genuinely a danger to your life, then that cost benefit analysis is outrageous, and the drug companies for allowing that are terrible people. When you think of like FenPhen, the weight loss drug that caused a lot of people to die, that one's bad. I'll link a podcast down below that explains that a bit better, because that was a bit shit from me. But if you're talking about something which is like, no, this is the life expectancy of this condition is months, and we didn't know if this drug worked or not fully, but you know, if it does work, we give them a couple more months, and if it doesn't work, well, they were gonna fucking die anyway. Like, it really felt like in a lot of these situations, these two examples were being conflated with each other, and I really feel like the sort of moral imperative of what we do there is very different. I don't know if I'm articulating myself very well here, but basically the book pissed me off is the moral of the story here. So read it if you want, but it was very annoying. Anyway, let's move on before I just rant at you for 20 more years. And then the last non-fiction book that I finished, because I did read a little romance novella at the end, but the last non-fiction is The Moon, A History for the Future by Oliver Morton. And this was another one that really didn't quite work for me. And like I say, November started strong, and then we slid downhill. This is a look at the moon, its historical place in our kind of culture and society, the ways that we have understood it historically, a bit of a look at NASA, what it means in our sky, what it means for sort of the origins of our universe, just like the moon in general. And this was one where, again, I wish somebody else had written it. Like, I've been really struggling with the authors of some of these books at the moment. So Oliver Morton, his writing style is very inconsistent. Sometimes it's incredibly poetic and lyrical to a point where it's actually then quite hard to understand what he's on about. Other times it gets a bit crass and a bit gross and a bit clunky. There are weird, like, quotations of various bits sort of shoved in without any real explanation. And it just felt very disjointed. Like, each chapter didn't feel like it really connected with the other one, and I don't think he's very good at explaining ideas. Yeah, that was sort of my big problem. I liked some chapters more than others. There were some really interesting concepts that I didn't know about. There was some very cool things going on in here, but I definitely had to text my mate, who is much more into astronomy than I am, to be like, what the fuck is this guy on about? What is this theory? Can you like summarize it in 3 sentences for me and let me know if it's controversial or not? Because like, this guy's talked about a theory for 8 fucking pages and I don't understand what he means by this. And again, I feel like I'm a relatively intelligent human being who can like, is pretty good at non-fiction, even non-fiction in areas that I don't know much about now. And this one was just a real struggle. So like, I don't think I would actually recommend this book, and it is going to spur me to go and read more in astronomy, but I think more just because I want to find the book about the moon that I wish this was, if that makes sense. But some stuff about the history of science which is cool, and a good, like, you know, it's a starting place, I guess, in some ways. And then the final book I read is a little novella. It's called Bite Me. I'll put the author up here. It's a paranormal romance about a zombie apocalypse where there are also werewolves, which is hella fun. And our hero basically rescues our heroine, although she's pretty good at kicking her ass by herself, from a horde of zombies where she'd jumped in to try and save somebody. And it is a sort of conversation about no, it's not. Sorry, I'm still like in non-fiction mode. Basically, it's about them coming together, and it's well cute. Like I said, it's a novella. It's short and sweet. I really liked the world building, and I really liked the characters, both our 2 main ones and a couple of secondary characters. I just kind of wish this book had been longer and there had been more fun to like luxuriate in it. I might see if the author has written anything more in this world, because it was really enjoyable. But I love the combination of like, there's a zombie apocalypse outbreak that's happened, we're all just trying to get on with our lives, and then werewolves appeared to be like, hey, we've always existed, but we can fight the zombies much better than you can, so we're gonna like defend our territory, and in doing so you humans are gonna benefit from this. Also, by the way, you're real cute, and you might be my mate. So yeah, really fun energy. And if you're into paranormal romance but you're looking for something that like bucks some of the tropes and trends of just like, you know, like standard, just in modern day, the werewolves have to hide kind of thing, the zombie apocalypse like made it feel quite fresh and fun. So that's everything I read in November. This video is so long. Can you tell I haven't filmed anything in a couple of weeks and I've lost the ability to do this? So let me know in the comments down below, how was your non-fiction November? Let me know in the comments down below if you're going to read the overhyped Fourth Wing and see if you think it's worth the hype as well. Have a wonderful reading week, and I'll chat to you soon. Bye!